Hey there and welcome back to the Bible Basher. My name is Hayden Washington. Today is episode 2 in my follow-up video to What is the Gospel. Today we are going to be looking at the historical evidence for Jesus' death and resurrection. So before we get into the video, my apologies to you people who have been waiting for my next video. I ended up breaking my camera, which was a devastating event to say the least for the momentum I had going for this. I moved apartments, as you may notice from the change of scenery. And I was sick, guys. It's just been a bit of a struggle. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. I'm going to break this down in 7 parts, okay? So the first part we're going to look at is the crucifixion or the cross. So number 1, we know that no one would have been able to survive a crucifixion. The Romans were masters at performing crucifixions and stretching it out for as long as possible and making it as painful as possible for their victims. We know that Jesus was whipped, beaten, tortured, all kinds of horrible things happened to him before he was even nailed to the cross. Then we know that he was nailed to the cross with big nails being put through his wrist region here and through his feet, where he was hung on the cross for up to 6 hours, which is just crazy to think. Ultimately, a Roman soldier pierced his side, which we know through the biblical writings, and blood and water came gushing out as the Bible records. The science behind the crucifixion is actually something very fascinating if you have the time to look into it. We know that they would break the victim's legs because they had to push up off their legs to be able to take a breath and then would ultimately sag back down on the cross. And they didn't break Jesus's legs because he was already dead when they went to go do it. Point number 2, Jesus and the tomb. How do we know that he actually died and was placed in the tomb? So as we know, he died on the cross, and then we know that he was taken down, wrapped in linen by Joseph of Arimathea, and placed in the tomb. The tomb then would have been guarded by up to 16 Roman soldiers, so it would have been impossible for anybody to come along and, kill the guards or disarm them and move the stone and then break Jesus out of the tomb. We know that for Roman soldiers to fall asleep on guard was punishable by death. So we know that they wouldn't have wanted to do that. And then we know that the tomb actually had a Roman seal or sign of authority on it, which means that if you mess with this tomb by the power of the Roman Empire, they can kill you. So another reason that no one would want to mess with the tomb. And we know that Jesus wouldn't have survived being in the tomb for 3 days, even if he didn't die on the cross, because he would have been in a pitch black tomb for 3 days with no medical treatment, water, you name it. He would have had nothing. He would have been in a tomb for 3 days bleeding out. Another reason we know that no one was able to sneak into the tomb was that Passover was on at the time in Jerusalem, which meant the city would have been filled with Jewish people from all around the region. So you wouldn't have been able to sneak around town by any means to break Jesus out of the tomb. And we know that if the tomb wasn't empty, where is the body? To this day, no one has found the body of Jesus, or no one records finding the body. And another point we know about the tomb is that women discovered the tomb, which at that time tarnished the testimony of it because of the cultural times that day of women's testimonies not being accredited. And the last one finally is, if we're looking at this from a agnostic or biblical worldview, meaning there's a creator, we know that this miracle is no big deal for God or a creator, because to simply raise someone from the dead is nothing compared to creating everything we see in the world today. Seasons, tides, animals, the ocean, you name it. Number 3 is the historical writings of Jesus, which are all non-Christian sources. So this one for me is the most fascinating of them all. Me growing up in church, I always believed the Bible and never doubted it. So seeing all the historical writings for this one was something that really blew me away. These historians were all hostile to Christianity, especially Josephus being Jewish. He would have looked at Christians as crazy and blasphemers. Josephus records that Jesus was a wise teacher who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, reported to have resurrected, and he was apparently the Messiah that the Old Testament or the Jewish law and writings talked about. Tacitus is a Roman historian who records Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate as well. and that the Emperor Nero killed Christians for their faith and for them not ultimately admitting that Caesar is Lord. Pliny is another Roman historian who records the Christians worshipping Jesus as God and obeying his teachings. We also have the Gnostic writings, which you can basically put the gospel together just from the Gnostic writings, and then there's many more historical writings upon that. With all these historical writings, we can basically put the gospel together. We see that they worshipped Jesus as God, they sang hymns, they celebrated the Lord's Supper and the forgiveness of sins, that he was crucified during Passover in Jerusalem, that he was the Christ or the Messiah, and he led Israel in new teachings, and he claimed to be God, and that he is coming back one day. Quite fascinating to know that we get all of that from historical writings who aren't Christians. Lastly, let's not forget about the Old Testament scriptures that we have. Some biblical scholars say that there is up to over 500 references of Jesus and his work and prophecies that he fulfilled. Isaiah 53 being the most famous one, which Jewish people have actually removed from the Torah because it messes with their whole idea of still waiting for a Messiah. Number 4 is the transformation of the disciples. We see at the time of the crucifixion that the disciples are scared and scattered all throughout the region, and ultimately seeing that this is the end, because they thought Jesus was going to come to overthrow the Roman government and free the Jewish people. So Paul is the most famous one, of course, who was a Pharisee, which meant he basically hated Christians and wanted to see them killed and arrested and thrown in jail, and ultimately Christianity to be destroyed. He was actually on his way to kill Christians when Christ revealed himself to him, threw him off his horse, and showed himself as Jesus. He then went on to become the most well-known Christian missionary that we know, and basically wrote majority of the New Testament. He preached the gospel all around the world on his missionary trips, despite persecution, fear of being killed, and ultimately this ended in him having his head cut off and being martyred for preaching the gospel. We even have James, who is Jesus' half-brother, who didn't even believe Jesus was God up until seeing the resurrected Christ. And then, of course, Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times as Jesus prophesied, who goes on to be the disciple that Jesus calls the pillar of the church. And he, in the same way as Paul, boldly preaches the gospel throughout his life, despite massive persecution, and is ultimately martyred for his faith, where he is crucified on a cross upside down because he deemed himself unworthy to be killed in the same way Jesus was. All the disciples were persecuted severely on multiple occasions for their faith, as they preached the gospel throughout modern-day Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and even Africa. They preached openly in the synagogues and in big cities, not fleeing to isolation like cults or things that are usually flawed do. Their lives all ended in horrific deaths, such as being stoned, beaten to death, crucified, impaled by spears, hung to death, thrown off 100-foot walls, and even flayed or skinned alive to death. You got to be asking yourself, why would they go through this? The reason is because they met the risen Christ. They saw that he had overcome sin and the grave, and that there was nothing to fear because we had heaven to come after this world. They wouldn't have gone through all of that for a lie. Given the opportunity to recant, none of them did. Their death shows us the power of the resurrection and what it means for us as Christians. And we now know that the death of Christians is a theme throughout history. We look at the early Christians under the Roman emperors, to the Protestant Reformation, and then being martyred by the Catholic Church. And even today, in many Islamic countries, Christians are killed for their faith. Point number 5 is the eyewitness accounts. We know that women discovered the tomb, which we've already covered, is controversial. And if you were trying to make something up for power, you wouldn't write this because it doesn't hold any credit to the testimony. As the women discover the tomb, they go and warn the disciples. They tell Peter and John, who surprisingly don't believe the women, so they run to the tomb themselves and discover that it is empty. They then begin to tell everyone throughout Jerusalem that Jesus has risen and the tomb is empty. Jesus then appears to all 12 of the disciples at different times, and up at one time to over 500 people. He walks the earth for a 40-day period where he revealed himself to people. Thomas, who doubts the most, even asks Jesus to show him the scars, which he touches and even puts his own hand in them because he didn't believe Jesus. Number 6 is the biblical manuscripts. So the New Testament is the most accurate ancient historical writing we have today. Nothing else even comes close. We have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, over 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and close to 10,000 manuscripts in other languages. The first full New Testament is recorded around 300 years AD. And the errors are mainly grammatical or spelling. It's not essential doctrines or teaching, such as the Christ or Jesus Christ. We know this because we have so many manuscripts to compare to with each other. We also have the early creeds, which Paul mentions in his letter to the Corinthian church. In 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about the resurrection. The resurrection was openly proclaimed and preached and spread right from the get-go. It wasn't something that started out later on. And we know that Paul openly says that if the resurrection didn't happen, all of this is a waste. But these people knew that the resurrection happened. Another thing historians point to is why start a movement based off of crucifixion, which destroys their credibility and is viewed negatively with a dead Messiah. As the scriptures say, cursed is a man who hangs on a tree. You wouldn't want to start a movement with a scandal. Also, another thing is the faults of the disciples are embarrassing, which is another reason why historians believe the Bible is accurate. If they were making this up, they wouldn't write things about themselves, such as Peter denying Jesus or Paul killing Christians. Also, early Christian writers considered the scriptures were authoritative and the word of God, as we do today, contrary to the myth of religion being used to control people. Lastly, let's not forget that Jesus predicted his death and resurrection multiple times in the gospel accounts. But the disciples didn't understand that he was setting up a spiritual kingdom, not a physical kingdom on earth. Number 7 is common myths, so let's debunk these. The stolen body or the swapped body myth is one that is popular in Islamic circles, as they state. As we already followed, this is impossible because of the busyness of the city, and the crucifixion was supervised by the Roman soldiers, so it couldn't have happened. Another one is hallucinations. This one is false because people cannot hallucinate the same thing. If you're taking drugs, everyone's hallucinating different things. Multiple people can't be seeing the same thing. Another one is that he didn't die. As we covered earlier, he clearly did. If the crucifixion didn't kill him, being in a tomb for 3 days would have. Another point is that the disciples made it up. As we've covered, why would you make something up like this? The disciples were all killed and martyred and tortured and persecuted for their faith. Christianity is not a religion of gain. It is a religion of denial of self and death. We are called to die to ourselves, pick up our cross and follow Christ, to give to the poor, to be servants of all as Jesus called us to be. It is not about financial gain or political gain. You can't explain the rise of Christianity any other way. These people had to have seen a resurrected Christ, and we know that the resurrection has power. Look at the impact that it's made on the world today. In governments, in women's rights, Christianity is the one that pushed for the modernization of the Western world that we see today. Bart Ehrman is one I would call you to go look into. Bart Ehrman is one of the biggest advocates for Jesus' historical resurrection and crucifixion, even though he is an atheist. So, fitting that Easter was last week, now you might understand why we follow these things as Christians and why you see that the world celebrates Easter. So I hope this video has helped you to understand Christianity a little bit more and the historical evidence outside of the Bible for Jesus' death and resurrection. Thank you and God bless.